Keep in mind where we just had that last chapter 4 where God humbled Nebuchadnezzar. And so he realized how that God was going to be sovereign over all the kingdoms of men. He was going to give it to whomever he wished, but he wanted to give it to those who would be humble. And that was the last word that we heard. And then in chapter 5 it begins, Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. We see this man by the name of Belteshazzar or Belshazzar. So keep in mind that as we're seeing here in chapter 5, if you're a note taker, just jot this down, because the head of gold is about to move into the chest and the arms of silver. What chapter 5 is that whole understanding where, remember we were reading in Daniel chapter 2 verse 32, where it made a statement as he was going through this whole understanding of where this image that Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. Let me read in verse 31 and 32. But it said, "You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. The image head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, and of course, in its legs of iron." So we see this image that comes through here, and where we're now about to go into the area where that head of gold is going to move into that chest and the arms of silver. In other words, the Babylonian Empire is about to end, and the Medo-Persian Empire is about to be started. It's that same thing that when we get into Daniel chapter 7, I want to read just 2 verses to you. I want to read verse 4 and 5, because he sees these beasts that come up, and he says, "The first was like a lion," in Daniel 7:4, "and had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it." Speaking of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian kingdom. Verse 5, "And suddenly another beast, a second like a bear, was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, 'Arise, devour much flesh.'" So we see this Medo-Persian Empire now comes over, and it's about to take on Babylon. And what God does is he uses this one portion here of the reign right now of Belshazzar. Belshazzar, if you're a note taker, jot this down. Jeremiah chapter 27. In Jeremiah chapter 27, I want to read basically the first 7 verses to you. Jeremiah chapter 27. When I start reading in verse 1, it begins this. "In the beginning of the reign of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, the king of Judah, the word came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, 'Thus says the Lord to me, make for yourselves bonds and yokes, put them on your neck, and send them to the king of Edom, the king of Moab, the king of the Ammonites, the king of Tyre, the king of Sodom, or the king of Sidon, by the hand of the messengers who come to Jerusalem to Zedekiah, the king of Judah, and command them to say to their masters, Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, thus you shall say to your masters.'" So he's telling these kingdoms, put a yoke on you, you're about to be taken into captivity, because thus says the Lord. Now verse 5, "I have made the earth, the man and the beast and all that are on the ground. By my power and by my outstretched arm I have given it to whomever it seemed proper to me. And now I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and the beast of the field I have also given him to serve him." So God is speaking to all these nations, and he says in verse 6, "I've given all of this to Nebuchadnezzar." Now here's the key verse as we get into chapter 5, which is Jeremiah 27, verse 7. "So all the nations shall serve him, and his son, and his son's son, until the time of his land comes, and then many nations and great kings shall make him serve them. So at this point we see that in Jeremiah 27 verse 7, it talks about Nebuchadnezzar, it talks about his son, and it talks about his son's son, in other words, his grandson. So what we see here is that Belshazzar is King Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. Let me give you a little bit of just information. Don't try to write all this down. I'd recommend just, getting the CD or going online. If you can write fast, go for it. But Nebuchadnezzar the king reigns for 43 years. Now he gives his kingdom to his son, Evil-Merodach. Now, we note him. I'm going to give you two passages in which he basically does the same thing. The first is found in Jeremiah chapter 52, verse 31 through 34. It says this, "Now it came to pass in the 37th year of the captivity of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 25th day of the month, that Evil-Merodach, king of Babylon," so this would be the son of Nebuchadnezzar, Evil-Merodach, the king of Babylon, in the first year of his reign, lifted up the head of Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, and brought him out of prison. And he spoke kindly to him and gave him a more prominent seat than those of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiachin changed from his prison garments, and he ate bread regularly before the king all the days of his life. And as for his provisions, there was a regular ration given to him by the king of Babylon, a portion for each day until the day of his death, all the days of his life. So we see, here that heart of Nebuchadnezzar's son, Evil-Merodach, as he takes the king of Israel and just really blesses him. There's another passage, it's a parallel passage found in 2 Kings chapter 25, beginning in verse 27 all the way through verse 30. It says this, "Now it came to pass in the 37th year of captivity of Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, in the 12th month of the 27th day of the month, that Evil-Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign, released Jehoiakim, king of Judah, from prison. And he spoke kindly to him and gave him a more prominent seat than those of the kings who were with him in Babylon. Jehoiachin changed from his prison garments, and he ate bread regularly before the king all the days of his life. And as for his provisions, there was a regular ration given him by the king, a portion for each day all the days of his life." So we see these two instances in which we see Nebuchadnezzar and his son Evil-Merodach. Now, although Evil-Merodach was very kind to the kings of Israel, we see here, if you're familiar with the history, that Evil-Merodach reigned for only about 2 years. And he was put to death by a man by the name of Nergal-Sharezer. He would be a son-in-law to Nebuchadnezzar. Let me actually just read you the passage. In Jeremiah chapter 39, verse 3, we're going to see that he's one of the princes. It declares this in Jeremiah 39, verse 3, "Then all the princes of the king of Babylon came in and sat in the middle gate, Nergal-Sharezer, Shamgar-Nebo, Sarakim, Rabsaris, Nergal-Sarzer, Rabmag, and with the rest of the princes of Babylon." So we see that he was one of the princes that came and sat down. So this son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar, basically he had married Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, and her name is Nitocris. That's her name. So he marries this Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, and he then kills Evil-Merodach, and he puts him to death 2 years into his reign. Now, as he's here, he reigns for about 4 years. This man by the name of Nergal-Sharezer reigns for 4 years. He's killed in a battle, and then he gives his son Labaski, Marduk, he gives him then the kingdom. But he only reigns about a year. And so within 1 year, he's killed by a man named Nabonidus. Now, Nabonidus, this is kind of weird. He also is King Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law, because when Nergal-Sharezer dies, Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, she goes and she marries this other man by the name of Nabonidus. And so here, Necrosis marries the first one that kills evil Merodach, and now she marries the second one, who then kills her son who had taken over the reign. But he does this so that he can reign. So Nabonidus is also a son-in-law to Nebuchadnezzar. Now, as I'm going through this, he's going to reign for 17 years. He reigns from 556 BC to 539 BC, to where right now, this is what's taking place in chapter 5. Now, what he does is he begins to neglect the Babylonian main god, the god of the sun, Marduk. And so he begins to raise up and elevate and position the Babylonian god Sin, which is the moon god. And so what he seeks to do is his whole heart is set on just building temples and basically trying to build temples for the Babylonian god Sin. And he's building the temples in this place called Tema. And while building the temples to Sin, he leaves his son. Now this is his son, whom he has with Nitrocus, and that is Belshazzar. So, and he's now, keep in mind that he's a co-regent. So at the time here we see in Daniel chapter 1, here's what you need to know. Neb has a daughter, Nitocris, and her first husband is killed. He kills evil Merodach, the son of Nebuchadnezzar. When he dies, his son reigns. And then Nitrocris has a second husband, Nabonidus. He kills the boy to rule, and then he leaves his son Belshazzar as a co-regent while he goes and builds temples to Sin. So that's basically what you need to know where Belshazzar comes on the scene. He is the son of Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. She, of course, has two husbands. The first son, of course, is killed. The second one is now here. Belshazzar probably has more, but these are the two that we have to make note of as we look here to this passage. So, all that being said, verse 1, Belshazzar is the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. Exactly what was spoken of there in Jeremiah 27, verse 7. The Babylonian kingdom would last until Nebuchadnezzar, his son, and his son's son. So what he's saying there in Jeremiah 27, he says, this is all going to end. You have to understand, it's all going to end. So before Belshazzar even comes on the scene, Jeremiah had already prophesied, in your reign, there, grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, it's going to end. You're the last one. And so what he does now is, there is this massive army that has now come and is not really laying siege of Babylon, but is coming to attack Babylon. Now, this is the Medo-Persian Army. Now, the Medo-Persian Army is going to be basically controlled by Darius, the Mede. He's the king. He has a general by the name of Cyrus. He's going to be the one that's orchestrating all these things as far as the attack. And right now, there is this massive army that is coming up against Babylon. And what is Belshazzar's, response to this? Let's have a party. That's his whole thing. He's not worried about any armies. Babylon was impenetrable. They had walls that you could ride 6 chariots side by side along the walls. They had that, seventh wonder of the world, amazing hanging gardens. They had food that they could have forever. They could keep planting their own gardens. They could do it all. They had the water of the Euphrates that they actually diverted coming right in through the city. So literally they were impenetrable. and they knew it. And right outside the walls, they had the Euphrates River that surrounded these walls that were at some places up to 300 feet high. So in incredible heights to where we're seeing here this city was. And then on the outside of the river, you had this smaller set of walls. So literally an army had to break through the smaller wall, had to figure out how to get through the Euphrates River, and then had to figure out how to break through these walls that you could ride 6 chariots across. Massive, massive defenses. And so Belshazzar is not worried. And you see the first thing that he does when he finds out, hey, there's this army out there, he has a great feast. That's what he does. So in verse 1, Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. And while he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold, the silver vessels, which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So as he's drinking in this great feast, he now has this really foolish idea. Let's take those vessels that my grandfather got from, Jerusalem, from the temple there, and let's use those vessels that were in that temple that was dedicated to their God. Let us use them. That shows how weak and how feeble that God of Jerusalem is. Well, know this, as soon as he does this, we see he moves from this wanting to have a great feast to now really coming to this great folly, where in his foolishness, he now declares in verse 3, then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines drank from them. Keep in mind that as we see this, it's not just here just the king, and it's not just basically his lords. You have the king, you have the lords, you have his wives, and you have his concubines. This feast is basically just this incredible display of licentiousness. Just whatever is going on, they can do it all here. Well, verse 4, they drank wine, and they praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. It's interesting that they use these terms. The first gods they do is the gods of gold, silver, bronze, and iron. What does that remind you of? Daniel chapter 2, the same as the image. And so you have those gods of the gold, the silver, the bronze, the iron, same as the image of the gold, the silver, the bronze, of iron. There in chapter 2, verses 31 through 33. But we also see then they also are praising the gods of wood and stone. Now, most commentators believe that what we're seeing here is that this is now in Daniel 3, verse 20. Remember when they said, throw them into the burning fiery furnace. That in most commentators believe that this is part of that it was some natural outcropping of stone that they had designed so it could become this incredible furnace. And so they have this there where you see basically the gods of everything that we've seen so far of Daniel 2 and Daniel 3 are now coming to pass where they're worshiping it. Keep in mind that when it comes to idols, there's no new idols. They're the same idols. We have the same idols with different names. That's all it is. That we serve the god and the goddesses of sensuality. We serve the goddesses and the gods of abundance. This, we put different names on them, but we still serve, they're still the same idols. They just are the same old idols with a new twist. And so from this point here, of him having this great feast and going and having this incredibly foolish idea, we see here that it changes instantly into verse 5 to this incredible fear. Notice what happens. In the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Now, at this point, we see here the fingers of a man's hand appear, and they begin to write. One thing that I want to make a note here, and for you note takers, jot this down. Beginning in Revelation chapter 17, I want to read verse 5, and then I want to jump to verse 18 and read verse 2, and then verses 5 through 9. Let me read now in Revelation chapter 17, verse 5. And on her forehead a name was written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and the abominations of the earth. Revelation 18, verse 2. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and has become the dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. And now in verses 2 or 5 through 9, we see this. For her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Render to her just as she rendered to you, and repay her double according to her works. In the cup which she has mixed double for her. Now, I find it interesting that he speaks of this cup now of Babylon here in Revelation, and he says, with this cup she's mixed double for her, and the measure that she glorified herself and lived luxuriously, in the same measure give her torment and sorrow, for she says in her heart, I sit as queen, and I am no widow, and I will not see sorrow. Therefore, verse 8, her plagues will come in one day. And keep in mind, Babylon will be taken in one day. That's it. So her plagues will come in one day, death and mourning and famine, and she will utterly burn with fire, for strong is the Lord who judges her. Verse 9, the kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived luxuriously with her will weep and lament for her, and they will see the smoke of her burning. So note this, in the same way as Daniel has this understanding where God begins to judge Babylon, we see the prophetic word there in Revelation where God also judges the new Babylon. He judges her with that cup that she has, judges her in one day. And in this sense, we see it's just a precursor. It's a sign, it's a symbol of what's going to be happening in Revelation. And so by the time we get to Revelation in a few months, we'll be, there in chapter 17, 18. We'll make reference here to Daniel chapter 5. So you get that whole back and forth thing. But this is what's happening. They begin to drink wine. They're praising the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. They're drinking these cups that were from the temple there in Jerusalem. And so, verse 5, that same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lamp. Keep in mind that here, the writing is to the point where everyone can see it. It's to the point in the room where it's illuminated. You have the lamp, and then the lamp is illuminating on a wall. And so where the greatest illumination is where these fingers are beginning to write here on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. We see here this hand of God that is just writing, the fingers of God that are writing here upon the wall. Two references that you might want to be aware of. The first is found in Exodus chapter 31, verse 18, which declares, and when he had made an end to speaking with him on Mount Sinai, he gave Moses 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone written with the finger of God. The other reference that I think is key is in John chapter 8, verse 6, where Jesus here is with that woman caught in the act of adultery, and it declares this. This they said, testing him, that they might have something which to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger as though he did not hear. And so we see here the very fingers of God, writing the tablets of stone, the law, the Ten Commandments. Also Jesus with the finger of God writing again in the dirt. And here in Daniel chapter 5, verse 5, we see the fingers of a man's hand appearing. And so as they're writing now opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall, the king's palace, the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Verse 6, and the king's countenance changed. He's no longer merry. He's no longer having this incredible feast where after he participated in this foolishness, he now has this great fear. And so his countenance changing. He's no longer all excited. He's no longer all tipsy through the wine.